And we are now recording. We are not yet live. We are live. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wherever you are in the world, you are listening to The New Way. The New Way on Steemit Radio. That's spelled with 2 E's. I am your host, Karen, standing in for a regular host, Dr. Lenny Tyme. Today we have a special guest. She's a returning guest, Miss Bridgette Lyn Dolgoff. And she is a jack of many, many trades, an expert at them all, but I tend to explain her as a holistic health practitioner, energy healer, and guru of sorts. At any rate, without further ado, welcome, Bridgette.
Good morning, Karen. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm just trying to, a lot of people in the Reno area have congestion because we have had the worst chemtrails of all time for about the last 2 weeks.
Really? Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah. There's like whole sheets. They spray like over the mountains. You can't see them, and then they come in as whole, sky sheets.
Wow. Why do you suppose it's like that concentrated in that area compared to
I think
someplace else?
Yeah. Well, I've heard lots of different stuff. I think that I've heard things like, the West Coast gets really heavy chemtrail spraying, all the way up and down. I think a lot of it has to do with the air currents, and they can manifest storms in the Midwest or from this location.
Got it.
I've also heard that they heavily spray because many of the cities on the West Coast refuse to have fluoride put in the water, so they double down on people to keep them kind of, asleep and subdued with more heavier, chemtrail spraying.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, so I think there's multiple reasons. I think most of it these days, though, has a lot to do with them using, weather as a weapon.
Oh, yeah.
Weaponized weather.
Yeah, Debbie is in our radio house. Yesterday she mentioned something about the huge hail down in, was it Guadalajara or something? And that
Yeah.
what was that about? Did you see that?
I follow a guy on YouTube called That's Impossible, and he reports a lot of, I have a couple people that I follow. I follow Mike Morales, who puts out a, global geoengineering weather report, shows you where all the chemtrails are and all the different radiators that are heating it up, and the HARP, and the signals by satellite. He shows all that every night, and he's really amazing, to watch. And then That's Impossible. He shows kind of like, he gets video footage from all over the world of aftermath of weather and just crazy. Sometimes he posts UFO stuff. He had the craziest, when he did the Guadalajara report. I mean, they had, in some cases, the hail was so massive that it literally lined the streets, and it was like 4 to 5 feet deep. And it actually broke open doors in people's houses.
Oh,
and they had like 4 or 5 feet deep of like a snow ice.
Oh, wow. Bizarro. I did see a picture of like an 18-wheeler truck that like they couldn't even open the door without stepping, without the hail. That's how deep it was.
Well, the thing is it's warm in Mexico right now.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
Totally. abnormal. But this is the thing, is they keep using different kinds of chemicals. And, they've been, seeding clouds since, 1940 in the United States. And back then they used lead. And so you can imagine they're seeding the clouds, with a lead cocktail to get them to nucleate, which is to create a ice, snow. And I think what's happening now is that, we know from Dean Wigington, geoengineeringwatch.org, who's a friend of mine, that they started using lead again in the chemtrail mixtures starting about, 8 years ago. And, a lot of the things that they use in chemtrails cause brain damage in mammals. Lead causes complete brain damage. This is why we have, 1 in 7 adults in the United States have Alzheimer's. And there are reports coming out, people dying at age 40 of Alzheimer's.
Yeah, I've noticed in the hospital that there are Alzheimer's diagnoses earlier and earlier than I remember it being when I started out my career over 20 years ago. But speaking of that, I wanted to ask you a question. I have previously consulted you about, vitamins and things. And one of the things, and I'm still taking everything that you recommended, and it's going great. But one of the things was the iodine drops, which I believe was just taking drops to coat the synthetic nervous system. Am I correct?
No, that's B vitamins.
Okay, that's
coat the nerve system.
Okay, but what do the iodine drops do? Isn't that kind of like you take to shield against these things that are being put in the clouds and 5G and all that kind of stuff?
Well, the iodine can help. I mean, mostly I think stuff that helps with the brain is omega-7, which is essential fatty oil. And then also taking a lot of essential fatty acids to protect the brain. And omega-7 is really good because you take it, and I always tell people to take it by recommended doses, what's on the label, because you don't want to double dose on it because you'll have a pressure headache. Because it actually helps with the pressurizing of the cerebral fluid and the brain, but it helps to combat the inflammation in the brain. And the brain... Once the brain gets inflammatory problems, then the rest of the body are going to have serious inflammatory problems. And inflammatory is, basically the doorway to death.
Right.
Once you get inflammatory anything, everything's caused from inflammatory. You're in the breakdown. So you could get, recently, one of the things that I'm working on getting my master herbalist certificate. And it's through wildcrafting. So I took 3 years of anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner's, plant medicine stuff. And then now I'm doing hands-on wildcrafting and plant medicine study. And one of the things that I realized that I didn't realize before was that what happens is we all have, inflammatory target areas. And we get whatever kind of inflammatory target areas from our mothers. All virus, disease, our mother's set up from her tooth buds and whatever kind of agents that she's carrying. When we're at fetus, we get them from her. And so whatever she had, this is why we could say things like, well, my mother had breast cancer. Well, she probably got a breast cancer viral agent from, her mother when she was a fetus, right? Mm-hmm. Because a lot of cancers are virus. And also, you could even look at, there's a brilliant Italian scientist that discovered that many of the cancer tumors in the body were actually candida. And he was actually treating them with injection of basically just baking soda and water to dissolve them.
Please, what is candida?
Candida is a fungus that we all have, but then when it starts to go into a plant growth phase, Candida can become actually like an ivy vine, and it will grow, a pretty massive rooting system, and then it can start puncturing, through the colon wall. We can start getting leaky gut, and it can grow up and puncture into the organs as it's growing towards the brain. And it's fed, Candida fungus, is fed by things like, processed foods, white foods, white sugar, refined sugars. It loves antibiotics. And so this is the thing about fungus and mold and some of these other things. For example, I tell this story a lot. I had a mini clinic. I was working with a premier immunologist who had a whole lab in Germany and was extremely brilliant. And I did all the structural and energy medicine. And I had a client that came in and brought somebody else because they wanted me to look at this weird patch that they had on their leg. And the patch was pretty large. And it looked weird. Whatever it was, you could tell that, it wasn't an eczema. But now I know, things like eczema, psoriasis, those are actually molds that are growing on the outside of the body. So they've moved into a plant form. And so, the regular types of treatment to get rid of them is not going to get rid of them.
Yeah, I was going to say, if this ailments are like plants, wouldn't it be best to treat them with other plants? Or how's that work?
Yeah, you have to get them down to where they're proactive versus planting in you like soil and taking you over. So it goes back to me going back to biodynamic school and doing biodynamic farming was really helpful to learn about soil and composting and stuff, and methods on how to treat the soil has really helped in my healthcare work because, medicine has no idea what they're doing at all.
Right. So it's not just about planting.
They treat things and makes it worse.
Okay, so it's important not just to grow your own food, but it's important what you're growing the food in, like the soil and the. Mm-hmm. And okay.
Yeah, because you are soil. Your body is soil. You have microbes in your blood that break you down, break down the old, and then rebuild it into something new. And when that process breaks, then you have inflammation. So when your microbes no longer work their 4-step process, and they go rogue, that's when you go into inflammatory disease. And then what happens is the microbes just break you down because you're in a death spiral. So they're actually just breaking you down, composting you. And there's no regenerative, build back up. But anyway, so this guy comes in with this patch, and so I was like, I don't really know what that is, and I don't really know how to treat that. So, I went and had my amazing, brilliant immunologist friend come and look at it, and she looked at it. She was like, I think she called it plantar something fasciitis, or lichen fasciitis, or something like that. And I was like, lichen? And she goes, oh, yeah, that's lichen. So she asked him some questions. She goes, were you in the military? He goes, yeah. She said, were you in forests for long periods of time? Wet forests? And he said, yeah. She said, were you in the forest for periods where you didn't shower or anything like that, sleeping on the ground? And he said, yeah. And she looked at me, she said, yep. So what happened was that because he wasn't showering, his clothes were wet. Lichen, in a microbial state is everywhere. And the lichen just found his leg to be moist and warm and moved right in and adapted itself to live on his leg like it would on a rock.
So even years later, it's still there.
Mm-hmm. And it was a pretty large patch. I'd say, it was like at least the length of a dollar bill.
Wow.
And round. And she said, that there was no way that you could remove it because he'd had a doctor say that, well, they could do a surgery and cut it out.
Mm-hmm.
And she said that, if you make it mad and aggravate it, it's going to change its form and it will become more aggressive because, it has a need to survive. And it's already adapted itself to the human body.
Oh,
so
wow.
The more you poke it and probe it. So anyway, I'm not really sure how they combated it, but one of the things that I learned in biodynamic farming, like how we deal with things like mold, so eczema. I have another story of a client of mine that I had who had, some really bad eczema patches on the outside of her, body that were, activated from getting a whole bunch of vaccinations and some other kinds of treatment. And so it really kind of messed up her immune system. And so she already had like a mold overgrowth, but she didn't really know it, right? I mean, a lot of people are exposed to things like black mold and funguses and all kinds of stuff. But what makes the difference is when our immune system gets low and then it becomes part of our, autoimmune system disease disorder.
Right.
And so what happened was that she didn't like it on the outside of her skin, and they kept giving her all these drugs to get rid of it. And then she did this test drug that was supposed to get rid of it from the outside. And I said, you got to be really careful with that stuff because if you aggravate it and it's forced internally, so yeah, it disappears from the outside, it will take hold internally. And she didn't really listen to me. And then about 6 months later, she calls me and she said that she's dying because the eczema moved into her lungs and is covering her lungs, and which means that it's growing on her lungs now, so her lungs can't actually expand and operate anymore.
Right.
And there's nothing they can do. So she's basically, as it's taking over her lungs, she's suffocating to death.
Oy vey. So can I ask you a question? Is autoimmune system at the root cause of most of these, most of our diseases?
Inflammation. So one of the things that I've discovered lately is, working with a lot of, wild plants. And mind you, all the plants that I'm working with are weeds. And it cracks me up because what do we do? I mean, we're so trained to spray the weeds, kill the weeds.
Yes.
And they're where all the medicine is to cure cancer, to cure the inflammatory disease before it can skyrocket. Like, for example, yarrow. Yarrow is a weed. It's, in the daisy family. And it actually, wet or dry, you can make a poultice out of it. You can, squish it into the deepest wound ever, and it will stop bleeding. It's unbelievable with blood stopping.
Oh, wow.
You can also take it internally in a tincture, if it's a good tincture, to help stop internal type bleeding. I mean, not if you have tuberculosis and your lungs are liquefying blood into blood, that yarrow is not going to stop that.
Forgive me, real quick, tincture, I hear that word a lot. What is tincture? That's just a small amount, or?
Yeah, you just can buy a tincture. It's a liquid extract of a plant.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so, and so you could take the yarrow, say you have a kidney or bladder infection, you may have a little bit of blood in your urine. You always want to, I hate to say check with a doctor, but I kind of have to say that. It's part of,
with the good old world liability and all of the, right.
Yeah, I mean, no matter how much certifications I have and how much education I have,
you still live in the system.
US, it's the mighty MD. Right. He's the one that he and she rule the roost and keep everybody else from practicing. So
right.
Anyway, So you could use yarrow. So one of the things that I'm learning from plants is that plants have individual focus, of certain areas. And so say, for example, you use yarrow, right, to help you with a urinary tract infection that may have some, blood involved, help clean it up. One of the things I'm realizing, is if you are prone to urinary tract infections, that's where you have inflammatory disease that you may have, gotten from a virus, like sexually transmitted, that you have that you don't know about that's targeting that area, or say your spine and your pelvis has been off for a really long time, so your brain can't send signals down to that area, pick it up and read it, and go down there and actually regenerate it, because that part of your body may be offline because you fell on your tailbone one too many times, and literally has cut the brain off from communicating through the spinal channel.
Oh, okay,
And
that
so
makes sense.
There's a lot of different things that can happen. But say you take the yarrow, what the yarrow starts to do is it starts to go in there and it starts to deal with the inflammation, and it starts to actually heal and tighten everything back up,
As opposed
so that
to
it starts to, because it's a pump.
Right.
Almost everything in your body is a pump of some kind, whether it's a manual pump or it's actually a pump.
Quick
question.
Like your
heart pumps.
So
right?
The
alternative. Your colon pumps.
The alternative is that we consider as taking anti-inflammatory versus yarrow. Big difference,
or
right?
Antibiotics, right? It would be a big, because then the thing is like you're throwing gas on a fire, by taking anti-inflammatories, but they're not going to give you anti-inflammatories for a urinary tract infection. They'll give you anti-inflammatories if you have some kind of muscle problems, or you have, chronic physical pain. But they're not going to give you anti-inflammatory for urinary tract infection.
Prescribed pills basically are not going to do what these weeds do, which you're saying yarrow actually regenerates.
Well, it gets in there and it heals and cleans stuff up, and then it actually starts to tighten up the area so that it starts to work properly, like a machine, like it tightens things back up, because I'm starting to realize, like, anytime you have any kind of bleeding or, infection or different kinds of things in your body, that means that area is not working well and it's degenerating. So it has a high inflammatory state. But then what happens is that if that spirals, that goes unfixed, and, then you have sinus infections that were never completely fixed. You have, respiratory stuff that, from colds you had in the past.
It's like a domino effect.
Different things that are going on simultaneously. They're never really cleaned up. Then eventually you're going to have blood inflammatory disease, brain, and then blood. And once the blood happens and the cells no longer, hold water, they no longer hold oxygen, and they no longer hold nutrition to be carried to the body and delivered, then you're in a death spiral. You're literally dying. Hold on 1 second. Hey, over here. Hey.
Bridgette has a dog that is literally her BFF. No, aren't all of our dogs a BFF?
Okay, so anyway, sorry about that. My dog was... She was going to go to the door and start barking at people in the hall.
I was explaining that your dog is your BFF, and then I said, don't we all have... aren't all of our dogs our BFF?
Yeah. No, I call her my business partner.
Aw. You even give her, like, you are healing of her, too. Like, you give...
Yeah, I work on people and animals and land. So,
wow.
Everything that I take, I give her. And so when she starts to have, different kinds, show signs of different kinds of inflammatory stuff, then, I start treating her. Say, for example, I'll notice some, gallbladder stuff, or liver stuff. Like, she doesn't seem to be digesting things very well. I might cut back on, fat in her diet and give her more vegetables. Or, sometimes I'll give her Wobezymes, which are, like the best enzymes from Germany, and you can really use those. They use them for inflammation, mostly of the joint and the tissues, but they're super good. You can use them at night to actually, help your gallbladder and liver dump, because we don't eat enough enzymes in our diet. So, most people have their gallbladder taken out because guess what? What's wrong with it? Oh, it's inflamed. Well, instead of the doctor telling you, how to get your gallbladder back in alignment, no, we'll just take it out.
Right. The quick fix.
Yeah. And I mean, the gallbladder is really important because it actually helps to take, cholesterol out of your blood. It helps to produce bile so that your body can break down the food into nutritional components that your body can absorb.
Wow. Amazing. Yeah.
And then, the other one, they take out your thyroid. And then women just get massacred because, they want to take your breasts off, your mammary glands. Hello, it's a gland. It has a purpose, whether they look attractive or not, what they've been used for. And they want to take your ovaries and uterus out. They want to take your thyroid out. I mean, sometimes they just, and this all boils back. I mean, this is the thing about women. It all goes back to kind of, the period, the turn of the century, maybe even before that in the 1800s. There's actually a documentary called Hysterical.
I think I've heard of that. Yeah. And they would treat women for hysteria?
Yeah. Hysteria. And so if a woman wouldn't comply to a man or the man's world, you decided you're going to wear pants. You decided that, you didn't really want to have children. You decided you didn't really want to clean the house. You decided you weren't going to cook any more meals for your food. You decided you're going to leave your husband and kids, whatever was going on with you. They would deem you by a court ruling to be in hysteria. And the only two treatments that they had for hysteria were the first thing that they would do once the judge would rule you as hysterical is they would put you in a mental health place.
So that's basically today's terminology, like incapacitated. Like incapacitated, like that's, if in today's term, the hysteria meant you were incompetent, incapacitated.
Well, yeah, I mean, but this was,
this was in the 1800s, right? Okay.
Yeah, because they, women still didn't have, rights. I mean, back then you were still cattle. And there's a really good book. It's called Women and Madness. It was written in, 1972 by a woman who was one of the first psychiatrists, really, to work in the mental health system and to really observe and see what was happening to women's mental health. And there were quite a few famous women that ended up in mental health. There's a famous poet, Ploth, and she wrote extensively in her diaries about the kind of treatment they got. They were drugged, they were raped, just all kinds of crazy stuff were going on.
Yeah.
But they were defiant women. They were brilliant and defiant women, and so their families would put them in as well. They would go along with the husband and be like, oh yeah, she needs to stay in there. They can't really do this kind of stuff to people anymore. And where they can, I mean, I know that there's some people that get gang stalked and then they get kind of carried off and into the back areas of mental health treatment centers and never seen again. Some of them do get out, but they're pretty effed up after. But the main course of treatment for these women during the hysterical period were, first they put you in the hospital, and then the first course of medical action they would take against you was they would remove your uterus and your ovaries because they felt that there was some kind of, sexual thing that was wrong with you that would make you kind of defiant.
Even if you were of childbearing age?
Yeah.
Wow.
Even if you were like 15 years old, 12 years old.
Oh, wow.
And then if that didn't work, then they would go back to the court and they would say, well, and then the judge would say, well, to the doctor, well, what would be your recommendation? And their recommendation would be like, well, a lobotomy. So then the next thing that they would do to women is they would give them a lobotomy. And the first lobotomies, they basically use coat hanger tools, up into the sinus cavity of women and grabbed, the frontal part of the brain and basically, mashed it up until the woman didn't respond to anything. It was like a walking catatonic.
Yeah. JFK's sister, Rosemary, I think was her name, had a lobotomy. And there's not a lot of information about her out there. She was kind of like the family, I don't know, secret or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. And the thing is she probably was a smart woman. She just didn't want to conform.
Right.
And so, think about this for a minute. Think about what would be in women in America's subconscious mind, regardless if you know anything about the history of women in your family, because at some point or another, you probably had somebody in your family line that was a little bit defiant, was a little bit smarter, wanted to be her own person, maybe didn't want to be married, wanted to wear pants, wanted to become educated, wanted to do things that, her family and other people, did not want her to do. And she was carted off and tortured, basically, in the mental health system. Because, that's where healthcare starts. I mean, the first drugs, in the healthcare system or the pharmaceutical system were Thorazine was one of the first ones, which causes a frontal lobotomy. Antibiotics came a little bit later, but these were like the first real drugs, right, that healthcare is like based on.
What's interesting? So, I don't think I should be surprised, but sometimes I do catch myself having cognitive dissonance. But I'm sitting here listening to you talk, and I'm having flashbacks to graduate school, studying, mental health, history, policy, blah, blah, blah. And it was basically taught that the beginning of the 1900s was the beginning of, for all intents and purposes, psychiatry. And we didn't really study anything about mental health or community wellness or social functionality before the year 1900. And now I'm realizing, wow. Wow.
Well, the thing is it's even, I think, there is a lot of proof out there these days. There's a lot of documentaries out there on, how psychiatrists are frauds and that they, serve kind of like no real purpose. They kind of, morphed into from also some of the stuff that was going on, in Germany and other places where they kind of had underground, medical type botchery, that was going on, and experiments, scientific experiments. They had, how many before Reagan administration in the 80s abolished the mental health system? For women, he did a huge service because your husband couldn't sign you in, your family couldn't sign you into a mental health system and leave you there. You couldn't just drop your healthy kids off there and never to be seen again. And so there were a lot of really horrible things that were happening in these healthcare centers. Some of them could house 20,000 people. And they were all being given, experimental treatments, like electroshock. A lot of them, were not clean. A lot of them were not properly fed. They didn't really care about these people. They behind a lot of these places. You see them a lot with paranormal, investigators go to a lot of these big abandoned, mental health hospitals. And because there's so much crazy ghost activity and demonic activity, it's because of how the people were treated.
Oh my God.
And were huge. They would just bury them. I mean, there was one facility on the East Coast that they think that the records showed that they buried like 50,000, corpses out in the back area. I mean, with no proper anything.
Wow.
And so in the 80s, those healthcare systems were abolished. And, then what happened is that we got extremely large homeless populations with people who have a lot of mental illness. I mean, you can't keep some people. I mean, there was no in between. They weren't going to change the laws. They just, shut it down. But there were a lot of people who could have used revised healthcare, especially people who they've been giving medications to their entire life. And now they're 20 years old. And now they have nowhere to live. Nobody's feeding them. They're on heavy medications. Now they're not on those medications. They were experimented on. There's no one to talk to, and they've been dumped out onto a street.
Okay, so the way that was taught to mental health professionals in our graduate studies was that was in the 60s. There was a big movement for deinstitutionalizing people, and to this day there's paperwork and forms you have to fill out to help people get benefits, that if they do need to be, let's say, in placement somewhere, you have to verify that it's not being done willy-nilly or abusive or oppressive to them. Long story short, it's interesting how just linguistically you use the word decentralizing. It's empowering to, why should a mentally ill person be in an institution when we can introduce programs that will help them thrive and maintain in the community, which also turns into, AKA, it's cheaper for them to be in the community than for us to hospitalize. Now, so it's spun in a positive way, and I'm not saying that the opposite of institutionalizing. I'm not saying that that's in the best interest of the person, but it's a case-by-case basis, and as Dr. Lenny always says, it's human scale, and it's very interesting what you're talking about that happened in the 80s, and it just, wow, it's like I'm getting a whole new spin on my grad school years.
Yeah, well, that's what happens, right? If you're awake and you're paying attention, your mind, starts to think, and you start to put things together. You can get a broader perspective of what the puzzle looks like.
Right.
And then you start to realize, like Lenny talks about human scale, that there is no human scale. There's no human scale out there. There's no animal scale, and there's sure as hell no nature scale.
Right.
I deal a lot with, I had Keith McHenry, who's one of the original founders and a friend of mine, on my radio show last Saturday, and we talked pretty extensively about the homeless, and he started a homeless union because in Northern California, the homeless are vanishing into internment camps. They take away their children as soon as people become homeless. And they're like, the forgotten people. They're not allowed to have a place to live. They're not. And this is the other thing, too, is how we're handling it all is wrong. I mean, really, because we've got a problem with we're spending way too much money on welfare and a lot of these other programs. So how, we've got to develop new programs where community is involved, and areas of your city are involved, and maybe, people build tiny housing, and, like a homeless person gets that for 5 years as they're working on to getting, into more stable lifestyle, trying to get them on their feet and get them a job and get them proper clothing and cleaned and making sure that they have nutrition. I think with homeless people, like the major contributing factor that makes them unstable after a while is the post-traumatic stress disorder of their families not wanting them or them not having families. Then they end up on the streets. They lose everything they own, even family pictures, anything that the last remaining things that may have been important to them.
Right.
And all of these things, cause post-traumatic stress disorder, which is really hard for them to come back to. And then compounded, if they are given food, if they do source out food, a lot of it that churches and stuff are